extraordinary afternoon sponsored by the Department of Jewish Studies. We're supposed to begin at 5:15, an odd hour to begin. Maybe a few people will trickle in, but I want to get going. So I'm sure some extraordinarily interesting material to cover today. It's my great honor to have a pleasure to introduce Mike Morgan. We've known each other, it's kind of hard to say exactly when the friendship began. Certainly, over the years, I have been a great admirer of his work. We had an epistolary, I think, friendship that began about 13 or so years ago. It was organized by John, actually. And then during one of his previous visits to Berkeley, I think it was something like 2013, and over the years we've seen each other several times since, most recently in Vienna at a conference on Gershom Scholem. And in addition to the friendship, there's also been an intellectual engagement. We have common interests, and I've learned enormously from his work on figures like Emmanuel Levinas, about whom he's written with extraordinary skill over the years. And I also benefited, and this was a great joy and surprise to me, from his earliest work on Greek philosophy. As I'm sure some, but not all of you know, Mike Morgan began actually, after his stint as a Reform rabbi, studying ancient philosophy. His first book was on Platonic piety, on the Athenian cults of the ancient world, and he's written quite a bit on ancient philosophy as well as the Jewish philosophy, showing that the road from Jerusalem to Athens is one that's still worth traveling. And he helped me enormously when I wrote a section of my last book on Greek attitudes towards rationality. So we've had really a conversation for many, many years. He's written too many books for me to list now. There are 11 single-author books, another 11 or 12 that are books of either primary texts or collected essays that he's edited or co-edited, innumerable essays on a wide variety of themes. In addition to the Levinas material, he's also, of course, been a great student and defender to some extent, and certainly disseminator of the ideas of Emil Fackenheim. He studied with Fackenheim. They became indeed very close. In his most recent book, a collection of essays called History and Moral Normativity, he has a very telling interview in which he describes the relationship with Fackenheim as a father-son relationship. They met after Mike's own dad apparently passed away, and there was clearly something that involved a deep emotional connection. Mike is now the executor of Fackenheim's estate, and will be telling us today about materials he's found in that estate, radio addresses that Emil Fackenheim, and I won't in any way tell you who Fackenheim was. I'm sure it's going to give us a clear sense of his importance. Radio addresses that Fackenheim made during the Second World War. Fackenheim was one of those theorists, one of those philosophers, one of those Jewish thinkers who combined a strong interest in philosophy. He also wrote on Hegel and ancient philosophy, but also in Jewish themes, and is perhaps best known as the formulator of what he called the 614th commandment. Somewhat controversial, but nonetheless still quite powerful, which is the commandment not to let Hitler have a posthumous victory by abandoning one's Jewish belief, or at least connection with Jewish people. And this is a commandment that has an immense moral weight behind it, and also touches on the historical dimension of both philosophy and Jewish thought. And it is very clear that Mike Morgan has remained in his debt, in the sense that his work also has an enormous ethical and historical dimension to it. So I've talked long enough, and I can easily go on much longer. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Morgan, who will speak today on Wartime, on the addresses of Emil Fackenheim during the Second World War.
Marty, thank you for really that extraordinary and very friendly and wonderful introduction. And I'm delighted to be here and at the special invitation of my good friend and once colleague at Indiana, John Efron, who has been here for longer than I realized as we spoke a short time ago. My remarks this afternoon, the talk is really kind of disjointed and informal. I hope you won't mind that it's not polished and kind of not neatly worked out. It's really, my hope this afternoon is to say a few words about Emil Fackenheim and to introduce you to a period of his life that up until recently we really knew very little about, and some materials that hopefully will be published within the next few years, materials that I think are very illuminating about a relatively early period in his life. Now, this is a picture, I suppose you'd be able to see the difference. Fackenheim is most known for his later work on the post-Holocaust Jewish thought. And at that time, of course, he's a much older person with a big beard. And here he is in the mid-40s. He was born in Halle in Germany in 1916. And this is one of the few pictures that we have of him in this period in the mid-40s. And the picture was taken in Hamilton, Ontario. And I'll say a little bit about what he was doing there in just a couple of minutes. Emil was born in 1916 in Halle. His father was a lawyer. He had a typical gymnasium education, studied classics when he was young. He died in 2003 in Jerusalem after having moved there in about 1982 after retiring from the University of Toronto, where for many years he had been a university professor of philosophy. Now, as Marty pointed out, Emil is best known for his post-Holocaust Jewish thought. And that's a period in his life that begins in the late 60s. Let's see if this works. What I've done is, I hope that you can read it. I've just tried to identify what we might think of as 4 stages of his life. The first period, his youth from 1916 to 1935, he lived in Halle, he went to school, he matriculated, and then in 1935 he moved to Berlin to study at what was once the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the liberal rabbinic seminary, but by that time had been renamed the Lehrenstadt. His father had been an associate of Leo Baeck, who was the great leader of German Jewry, liberal German Jewry. And Baeck had been the international president of the B'nai B'rith, and Emil's father had at one time been president of the local B'nai B'rith in Halle, so they knew each other. And Emil began the Hebrew Union College then in 1935, which is 2 years, of course, after Hitler ascends to power and the National Socialism takes control of Germany. The second period of his life covers the period roughly from, I say, their education and early career, 1935 to 1948. And in a minute, I'll tell you something more about that. This period, he remains in Germany from 1935 to 39. And he flees Germany in 1939. I'll explain how that happens. He finds himself in Toronto in 1941. And on December 15th, he matriculates at the University of Toronto in the Department of Philosophy as a graduate student in 1941. Remains in Toronto for 2 years, finishing up his coursework. And then, as he's about to begin his work on his doctoral dissertation, he moves to Hamilton, Ontario. Hamilton at the time has a Jewish population of about 3,000 people. And there's a small Reform congregation, Anshe Shalom, that had about 50 families in 1943. And he is given the position of rabbi of the congregation. The responsibilities are not, he admitted, onerous. In his memoir, he points out that he really didn't have tremendous responsibilities, but he took upon himself some communal responsibilities as well. He remains there, I'll come back to this in a minute, remains there for 5 years, 43 to 48, when he's invited by the chair of the philosophy department at Toronto, a man named F.H. Anderson, who was a Plato scholar, to return to Toronto to teach metaphysics in the philosophy department. And he accepts the offer, and he returns to Toronto in 48. So that's period number 2. I'll come back with some more details in just a second. The next period I call the period of existential theology and philosophy, Toronto, 1948 to 1966. And the reason I separated 1966, he remains in Toronto until 1982, teaching at the University of Toronto. But it's during this period of 1948 to 66 where he engages in what he calls scholarship with two hats. On the one hand, technical philosophy. And he begins a project in German philosophy, particularly on the problems of the relationship between faith and reason from Kant to Kierkegaard. And of course, he also teaches during this period. At the same time, he begins writing essays of contemporary Jewish theology, particularly from the point of view of what he thinks of as, what he conceives of as religious existentialism. And this is really what we learn most from these new materials from the 40s, is how his view of religious existentialism begins to take shape during that period. The reason that I marked the end of this period, 1966, a couple of reasons. One is about that time, 66, 67, he collects together all of the important papers that he had written from the late 40s through the 1960s on Jewish theological subjects into a collection that Indiana University Press published in 1968 called Quest for Past and Future. And it's really a remarkable collection. Just the essays are beautiful and extremely articulate, written for wide intellectual audience, but written with a kind of precision and clarity and grace that's really quite remarkable. So one reason for ending the period around 1966 is the publication of that volume. It's also just about that time that he finishes 10 years of work on a book that he published in 1968 called The Religious Dimension in Hegel's Thought, which is still, I'm told by my friends who do German idealism and Hegel scholarship, still the best, if not one of the very best books we have on the religious side of Hegel's thought. But really probably the most important reason for ending that period in 1966 is that it's about that moment that Fackenheim admits explicitly that he is now confronting the horrors and the atrocities of the Nazi regime, and confronting the horrors of the death camps is no longer avoidable. And he admits to having felt a kind of moral compunction to deal with these events and seek to cope with them. And the explicit occasion on which that takes place is an invitation that he received from Stephen Schwarzschild, who taught philosophy at Washington University and was editor of Judaism, a quarterly journal. Schwarzschild, together with Fackenheim and a number of other Jewish theologians, had for a few summers been meeting outside of Montreal in the Laurentians to discuss theological topics. And they agreed that in 1967, in the spring, when the board of trustees of Judaism magazine, the American Jewish Committee, was to meet in New York, they would have a public symposium on the Holocaust and Jewish life and Jewish experience. It was the first public event of this kind. It took place on Purim, which also was Easter, March, I think it was March 24th or 26th, 1967, and it was called Jewish Values in the Post-Holocaust Future. And there were 4 symposiasts who were invited to make remarks. Fackenheim was one of them. One of them was George Steiner, who was a literary critic who taught at Cambridge and Geneva, and Steiner had written an essay called Language on Silence on the early work of Elie Wiesel. The third participant was Richard Popkin, who was taught philosophy and the history of philosophy and the history of skepticism at Washington University. And the fourth symposiast was Elie Wiesel. And Fackenheim felt that he could not turn down this invitation to make a public statement on what Judaism and our society should be like, our culture should be like, if we take the Holocaust seriously and seek to engage with it. And it's on that occasion, the very first time, March of 1967, when he uttered the so-called 614th commandment, Jews are forbidden to give Hitler any posthumous victories. Subsequently, he cites that several times. It became so famous that I once heard a lecture by Raoul Hilberg, in which Hilberg, who had written that massive 3-volume work on the destruction of European Jewry, began by referring to a Jewish theologian who thought the Holocaust was so momentous that he formulated an 11th commandment. Right? So it became so famous that it got misquoted. I guess that's the real sign of fame. So Fackenheim, it was in '66 that he received that invitation. And so that period really is a period that we know something about, good deal about. He published a number of things during that period, essays, which were later collected, and he was working on the Hegel book, and he began his Holocaust period. But this is the period that's best known. That is the period from 1966 to 2003, primarily the earlier of the two, the Foundations period, the Toronto period, that begins with that symposium, with his little short statement, the 614th commandment, continues with the Charles Deems lectures at NYU in 1968, which came to be published 2 years later in 1970 as God's Presence in History. The short 120, 130-page book that really became his most famous and widely read publication. It then continues with essays and talks over the next decade, and the publication in 1982 of a book that he always thought of as his magnum opus, To Mend the World, Foundations for Future Jewish Thought. It was published in 1982, I think by Schocken, and it's gone through 3 different editions with new introductions. He then makes Aliyah, moves to Israel in 1982, and remains in Israel for the remainder of his life, writing essays, giving talks, and whatever. I'll make a controversial statement, perhaps one that's very suggestive. I won't say much about it. But he remained during that period a somewhat marginalized figure in Israel during that period. But he dies in 2003. Now, I'd like to take us back, because the materials that I would like to talk with you about in a few minutes are materials that a colleague of mine, Saul Goldberg, and I discovered in the archives in Ottawa from the period of 1943 to 1948. Now, Emil Fackenheim completed his doctorate in 1945. Actually, I have a copy of the dissertation, and it has 1944 written on it, crossed out 1945. He defended it in March 1945. The title of the dissertation, for those who like to know these matters, the dissertation, which he wrote under the influence of Leo Strauss, in the following sense, it's on medieval Arabic philosophy. Okay? When Fackenheim was probably when he was in high school, that is before 1935, but certainly within a year or two afterwards, he had studied some Maimonides and medieval philosophy. And when he had studied these things, he came across the work of a man named Gutmann, who was a very prominent historian of Jewish philosophy. And he then read a critique of Gutmann written by this young scholar, Leo Strauss, that came to be published in a set of essays called Philosophie und Gesetz, Philosophy and Law. And what really impressed him about Strauss was that Strauss realized that the issues that Maimonides was dealing with, which was by and large the relationship of faith and reason, faith and philosophy, were not archaic historical subjects of only historical interest. They were vital and critical matters for every Jew even today. That is, Strauss had emphasized how the issues that one needed to engage with regard to Maimonides were not simply antiquarian matters about textual issues or precisely what Maimonides said at one place and whether he took it back in another place, but whether or not there was a view of revelation in Maimonides that one could take seriously as the foundation of Jewish faith and Jewish experience. And Fackenheim was committed to this, I believe, because with the rise of Nazism, the question of continued Jewish existence was a matter of life and death concern for the Jew in Germany, in Weimar Germany at the end of the 20s and the early 30s. Fackenheim was convinced that on that issue, Strauss was absolutely right. And therefore, from that moment on, in a strange sort of way, although he was never a Straussian and didn't read a lot of Strauss at all, and certainly didn't follow him in lots of ways, he felt that Strauss was a model. He was a model of someone who realized that the issue of revelation or no revelation, that is, a relationship between the human and the infinite and the absolute, the human and God, that this was a vital question for Jewish experience and therefore for the continued existence of Judaism. If one could not make that case, he believed that Judaism was grounded in a relationship to transcendence, to the absolute, then Judaism was a fragile, ephemeral matter not worth living your life for and risking your life for. Okay, now, so Fackenheim wrote the dissertation, and the title of the dissertation, he did this because Strauss himself had taken seriously medieval Arabic philosophy. And so if Strauss thought Arabic philosophy was important for understanding Judaism, then Fackenheim said, I'm going to study Arabic philosophy. And he knew Greek and Latin, and he learned Arabic, and he wrote a dissertation with the pithy title, Substance and Perseity in Medieval Arabic Philosophy, with introductory chapters on Aristotle, Plotinus, and Proclus. Okay? It's a nifty read. It's actually quite interesting. The perseity from the notion of per se existence, that is the question of the relationship of substance to things other than substance. So it's a kind of critical philosophical issue. Now, up until very recently, I think when people think of Fackenheim in those years from 1943 when he started his doctoral program to 1948, those years when he was in Hamilton and finishing his degree, got the degree in 1945, as primarily invested in medieval philosophy. He wrote some reviews on medieval Arabic philosophy, and he wrote a short article on medieval philosophy for a collection of essays on the history of philosophy, and a couple of things of that nature. But as Saul Goldberg and I discovered, there are a number of unpublished materials from this period, 1943 to 1948, that shed a good deal of light, I think, on Fackenheim's emerging religious existentialism, and particularly his debts to figures like Schelling and Kierkegaard, and the kind of conception that he develops of the relationship between ethics and moral questions on the one hand and kind of religious existentialism on the other. Let me take us back just a half a step, and let's see, I want to be sure, okay, good. Fackenheim was a student from 1935 to 1939, rabbinic student. 2 days after Kristallnacht in 1938, he was taken by the Gestapo to Sachsenhausen. He remained in Sachsenhausen for a period of about 3 months until February 8th of 1939, when, for reasons that remained unclear to him to the end of his life, he and 2 other students were allowed to leave. And they were told that they had 6 weeks to leave Germany, otherwise they'd be reincarcerated. Okay? He immediately went to the Lehrenstadt and told the people there that they better be really concerned and not continue to study and try to figure out a way of getting out of Germany. He, on May 12, 1939, he fled Germany with barely any money, a little clothing, and a couple of books. His older brother Wolfgang, his brother Wolfgang, who changed his name to William, Fraser, had already moved to England. Fackenheim went to England, but then immediately traveled north to Aberdeen in Scotland. Aberdeen had accepted him as a student, and he began a doctoral program in philosophy in Aberdeen. He found very little there of philosophical interest to him. He used to say that that was where he first read Hegel. It wasn't the first time that he was introduced to Hegel. There was the Lehrenstadt in Berlin had taken had given teaching opportunities to a number of Jewish scholars who had been dismissed by their universities. And one of them was a man who was a philosopher and had been one of Husserl's assistants, a man named Arnold Metzger. And Metzger taught these rabbinic students who knew no philosophy, by and large, something about philosophy, and he found it very, very challenging. But Fackenheim always would remember a Saturday evening actually, when Metzger would invited over to his house a few of the students whom he thought were capable. And he opened the Phenomenology of Spirit in front of them, and he opened a bottle of schnapps, and he said, "We're going to get through the schnapps. I don't know that we're going to get through the phenomenology." And they stayed up most of the night studying Hegel. Fackenheim would say later that from that moment on, he knew that understanding Hegel was going to be momentous for his intellectual development. But he didn't understand a word of what had been said. So he returned to Hegel in Aberdeen. And after about 6 months at Aberdeen, as a German refugee, he was taken to a DP camp, and then eventually to the Isle of Man, and then given an opportunity, along with other German refugees, to find a home somewhere in the British Empire. And he chose Toronto, to Canada, along with, among his other friends, an old friend of John's and myself from Indiana, Heinz Fischel, or Henry Fischel, who was a student of Second Temple Judaism and Hellenistic Judaism. And they were old friends from the Hochschule. They found each other again, and they both took the boat to Canada. Immediately, and this was in July of 1940, they were placed into an internment camp. And Fackenheim always used to say, "I thought we had been past all of that." Sure enough, what do we find? Another camp, right? Where they're moving from camp to camp to camp. And he remained in Sherbrooke for over a year, in fact. Sherbrooke is east of Toronto. And then on December 15th, he's released. And the way he tells the story, he immediately went to the graduate director of the philosophy department on December 15th and said, "I want to study philosophy." And the director said, "Well, what are your credentials?" And Fackenheim, with a chip on his shoulder, said, "I went to the Lehrenstadt. I didn't receive a degree, although they made me a rabbi before I fled. I went to Aberdeen. They accepted me. I didn't receive a degree. Now I'm here. I don't have any degrees." Right? And the director of graduate studies looked him in the eye and said, "What's good enough for Aberdeen is good enough for Toronto. What do you know about Aristotle?" And they began to talk, and Fackenheim said that he found a home. Now, it took him 2 years to complete his coursework, 1943. He then took a position as a rabbi in Hamilton, Ontario, and remained there for 5 years. Now, it's this period, roughly from 1943, once having completed his coursework, to 1948, when he's invited to return to Toronto to take a position in the philosophy department, a period that we really know nothing about except the dissertation, until fairly recently. And let me I think this is going to turn out right. Let me indicate very briefly some of the things that we discovered in the archival holdings in Ottawa from this period that I think are illuminating, okay? And I want to go through some of this, and then I'm going to return and talk about a couple of themes and to try to give it some intellectual substance. First of all, among the various talks and papers, there are a few more than this. These, I think, are the most tantalizing and the most interesting. One of them comes from the period when he's still a graduate student, a paper on value in some recent philosophies. And then the year later, in 1944, a paper given to the Philosophical Society at the University of Toronto on some metaphysical implications of pragmatism. Then a year later than that, to the same society, a paper in which he refers back to this paper about pragmatism, a paper with the tantalizing title, Existential Philosophy as a Critic and Heir of Idealism. It's a paper in which Fackenheim gives very brief account of Kant and then Schelling, and then points out in particular how existential philosophy, as he sees it, coming through through Kierkegaard, is indebted to the later Schelling, in particular the later Schelling, and Schelling's critique of Hegel, and therefore also Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel. So he sees existential philosophy as grounded in this critique of Hegel, that the Hegelian system can only count for possibility, it can't count for actuality. And then there's this paper from 2 years later, The Background and Significance of Existential Philosophy, in which much of the same material is retooled and reorganized and developed further and given to the Philosophical Club at CCNY in 1947. So those are, in addition to these, we have a talk that he gave on Soren Kierkegaard to the Philosophical Society at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And it becomes very clear in the paper on Kierkegaard how much Kierkegaard means to him as the existential critic of the idealist systems. And therefore, as the person, and also the person who treats the plight of the individual that is somehow left out of idealist philosophy as left to cope with the paradoxes of human existence in such a way that it opens itself to the absolute, that is to God, and thereby reconciles itself to its life in kind of fragmentary, the fragmentary finite human situation. So that's a paper that he gave in McMaster in 1944. I think this is going to come into focus, and I didn't type it out because this is the way we have it. This is from 1945, and it's the sketch of a book project that was to have 5 chapters called Angel and Beast, Faith in a Time of Perplexity. So the perplexity suggests that he's recalling the Maimonidean challenge that Judaism must face the perplexities of the human condition. And the account is set up in such a way that it begins with an overview of the human condition and then finally ends with a chapter in which it deals with some, at the time, kind of approaches to human fulfillment that treated the notion of self-realization as the focus of human attention. Now, this sketch he had worked out in 1945. We have 2 copies of it from the same year. None of it was published as we have it. However, we do have a piece of one of the chapters and selections from some of the earlier themes together with the bulk of this last chapter eventually become the bulk of two of his earliest writings. One is an essay called The Modern Jew's Faith, A Path to God, Inviting the Great Encounter. And it appeared in the very first issue of Commentary magazine in 1950. Okay, Commentary had been established a couple of years earlier. And I'd like to read you a little bit from this essay, because the themes that are articulated in this essay about the human condition will return very briefly, we'll see in some of the radio talks that I'll say something about shortly. He says the following: generally, discussions of this need for ultimate integration on the part of us as human beings are located under the rubric of self-realization. Self-realization is the integrating ideal for the two main philosophic schools, the idealists and the naturalists. The former, the idealists, mean by this term the realization of an ideal self slumbering in every person. The latter, that is, the naturalists, refer rather to the whole realm of self-expression, physical as well as spiritual, social as well as individual. It is a conviction common to both idealists and naturalists that the human person need not turn beyond himself or herself and his society in order to achieve self-understanding and self-integration. He may need his fellow men, but he needs no God. The idealist feels that man is able to form a true image of his ideal self, and that he may approximate this ideal even if he never entirely realizes it. To the naturalist, the integrating ideal is individual and social health. Evil is mental disorder or social maladjustment. Health produces social harmony because it balances pleasure and duty, a healthy egoism and a healthy altruism. It produces inner harmony because the healthy person concentrates on such of his problems as are soluble, ignoring those which are insoluble. And then a couple of pages later, he goes on in the following vein. But this represents, that is, the failure of both the idealists and the naturalists to come up with an adequate notion of self-realization. This abysmal failure, he says, represents the failure to understand what he calls here the tragic element in human existence. Progress in degree, important though it is, never spans the gap in kind, he says, from the is to the ought, that is, from the fact that we are animals and beasts that can be understood, beings that can be understood naturally, on the one hand, and on the other hand, ones that can set an ideal for themselves that is transcendent. Okay? And he says, try though he may to transcend them, man always remains implicated in the web spun by his animal nature. The idealist is quite correct in asserting that the absolute ideal inspires to imitation. But his romantic optimism, together with a good deal of hypocrisy and self-righteousness, makes him overlook the fact that the absolute ideal also paralyzes because of its very absoluteness. For to know of the heights at which we ought to be is to be in despair at the depths at which we are. He then goes on a paragraph later. Classical Judaism had a different insight into human nature than the one that is taken by either the naturalists or the idealists. It realized that in the words of Moses of Kusi, who was a 14th century Talmudic commentator, and then he quotes, "It is because man is half angel, half animal, that his inner life witnesses such bitter war between such unlike natures." On the basis of this insight, Fackenheim goes on, classical Judaism saw that the quest for ultimate integration was not a quest for new God ideas, or new moral systems, or new techniques of adjustment and adaptation, all of which are human products and hence themselves bear the traces of the contradiction of human nature. Classical Judaism understood that it was a search for God, not for religious experience or religious ideals, but for an existing God, a God who really speaks through the turmoil and confusion of human life, a God who, in relating himself to man, resolves the contradictions of human existence, a God who, by his justice and mercy, gives meaning to human destiny. Okay? Now, 2 years later, Fackenheim would provide a more ambitious version of the same paper in the very first issue of Judaism, a quarterly journal that appeared in 1952 in an essay called Self-Realization and the Search for God, in which he criticizes these views, the romantic or idealist view on the one hand, the naturalist or the therapeutic view on the other hand, for both of them for failing to appreciate the conflicted and paradoxical nature of the human condition, or what he calls the tragedy of the human condition. Now, by 1950, I have just a few more things to say, and I want to bring the radio addresses into the mix. By 1950, Fackenheim had committed himself to what he referred to in this period then as religious existentialism. He tells a story of a conference that was held in Cincinnati before the CCAR annual meetings of Reform rabbis in Cincinnati, 1950, when he was approached by Nelson Glick about a possible position at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And he never received the offer. He heard back from a friend it was partly because Glick had heard that he was a card-carrying existentialist. Okay. So the question that I put to us is, part of his view of religious existentialism is that the leap or the decision for faith and to open oneself to the existing God is a response in part to an appreciation of the tragic character of human existence, and to find meaning in that situation in which, left to human affairs, all one would have is paradox. I think that if we look at the materials of the certain materials from the 1940s, we see the emergence of the view that was just articulated in that paper. The view that he associates with Rabbi Moses of Kusi, that is, that man is both angel and beast, okay, which is the title, after all, of this projected book project in 1945. There are two major kind of resources. The first resources are a set of radio addresses that he gave between 1944 and 1948, Sunday mornings from 9 to 9:15, as part of a Jewish cultural hour that was broadcast every Sunday morning. Occasionally there were talks at other times. We have the manuscripts. We have unfortunately, no recordings of these that I've been able to locate. But we have the manuscripts of 72 of these. 72 of these. And they start with one for New Year's in 1944. And some of them, where the titles are in brackets, I've just added the title to indicate what some of the materials are, what some of the contents are. Many of them are based on his sermons from the Friday before. They are frequently associated with the text for the week. And they are almost always on moral subjects of one kind or another, moral and ethical subjects. So this is the first series from 1944. This second series begins the beginning of with the address on prayer. As you can see, occasionally there are ones on topical issues, like the address for the Canadian Red Cross drive. He has an address at the time when the Canadian Citizenship Act is passed. He has an address on the occasion of the meeting in San Francisco to plan for the formation of the United Nations. This is the remainder of 1945. This is the third series from 1946. These are the last ones from 1946, the Canadian Citizenship Act, The Good Life, Motive or Consequence. And then this is the fourth series, 1947. Now, in 1947, he also, on Sunday afternoons, gave this series of 7 talks on a kind of popular moral philosophy, in which he begins by discussing the 2 perspectives that we can take on the human condition, the perspective of an active, involved agent, and the perspective of a third party reflecting on the human condition. He then discusses the requirement of morality that it be objective, and therefore that it rise to a level of independence from the perspective of the participating individuals. He then turns to social and then individual obligations and how they frequently conflict with each other. And he indicates that because of the prominence of the conflicts, a natural choice for him and for others is a choice to commit to a religious life that involves a relationship with God and a attempt to work out that relationship to God in such a way that one can cope with the conflicts of the human condition. This is the remainder of the talks for 1947, and then 1948, the last ones before he leaves at the end of May to take the position in Toronto. This is a very interesting lesson on Czechoslovakia's second destruction. This comes after the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. Now, I know I've taken quite a lot of time, but let me do just one last thing if I could. I had selected, it just shows you how easy it is when you don't prepare tightly to take time, kind of reminiscing and filling out some details. I selected about 7 or 8 of the talks where I made some notes to myself about how extraordinarily interesting they are in their own context. One, for example, from 1947, is a charge to Canada and the United States to take greater responsibility with formulating an immigration policy that would respond to the plight of the DPs and refugees in Europe after World War II. Another one is, as I said, on the Canadian Citizenship Act, and he reflects on the importance of democracy as a way of confronting the challenges of tyranny and anarchism, tyranny on one side, anarchism on the other side, and how citizenship, however, must always fight against the potential apathy that would lead people not to take their citizenship seriously, with sufficient seriousness. He reflects on the importance of freedom and the freedom of the individual and the freedom of a free society in the wake of, whoops, I wonder what I did. Well, whatever, it's sort of pretty. In the plight of the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. He has an extraordinary, after the war is over, and armistice is about to be declared in April and May of 1945. He points out that there are many things that one has to do after a war, such as the one that has just been completed. He said, but most of all, we need to open ourselves to everyone, to our enemies as much as our friends, and that requires a special kind of tolerance. And he gives a talk on tolerance in which he argues that tolerance is not shaped by and doesn't thrive on enlightenment and education. Knowledge doesn't by itself bring tolerance. It's not sufficient. What one needs in addition is a sense of humility. And that humility, he says, can only really be grounded in a sense of a deep existential sense of one's own finitude and limitation. And for that, speaking to the clients that he's speaking to, the best way to cultivate that kind of virtue is to recognize the existence of a transcendence that one gives oneself over to, that indicates that one can nonetheless, one can survive nonetheless in a situation in which one has to grapple with one's own limitations. This will be my kind of culmination. In 1987, I offered to collect together a number of his writings at the time because I thought that there was a lot about Fackenheim that was not well appreciated. And the volume was going to be published by Indiana, but the editor then moved to Wayne State. So we published it with Wayne State University Press. It's a book called The Jewish Thought of Emil Fackenheim. And it collects articles from throughout his career. Emil asked me, after he saw the table of contents, if I would include two pieces that I didn't know anything about because they hadn't been published. One was an essay that he had written in 1938 before he fled Germany. He and other students had planned to write a kind of departing volume in honor of the seminary because they knew they were going to have to leave. And he had picked the topic of halakha, Jewish law, and he wrote that essay. He translated it and it's in the volume. The second was a piece that at the time he told me he gave it on the radio, but I had no idea when or what the circumstances were. And he gave it to me. It's called The Psychology of the Drum. And I think it's quite remarkable. It's one he said at the time in 1987 that he was still proud of. I think it's widely thought that Fackenheim simply set the Holocaust out of his mind until 1966 and did not think about it. But let me just take a couple of minutes and tell you what this essay is about, and that will be my conclusion. The Psychology of the Drum. He says, until in this talk, Fackenheim links 3 dates from the past, because the talk is given on November 11th, 1945. And in the talk, he associates this day with 3 dates early in November of the past. November 11th, 1918, when the armistice was declared after World War I. 11 a.m., the 11th month, the 11th day of the month, 1918. Secondly, November 9th, 1923, the suppression of the beer hall putsch and the rise of Nazism. Third, November 10th, 9th and 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht. Right? And then he asks, after talking about each one of these dates, what is it, this dreadful secret, which created hordes of barbarians destroying all that 1918 attempted to create? We must know it, not only in order to explain what happened, but also to make safe the achievement of 1945, which had just had taken place earlier that year. And he goes on. The secret lies in the uncanny power of the drum, in the demonic spell which marching can exercise over the souls of men. And he goes on. It is not literally the drum that explains the influence of Nazism and its effect. Rather, he says, the marching of the masses can become an evil frenzy, destroying the humanity in man and forging them into a brutal machine of cruelty and destruction. Fackenheim then calls upon the economic, social, and historical explanations that are often cited for the rise of Nazism. But he sets them aside. They don't come to grips with the real issue. He says, it is futile to pile up explanations concerned with the external situation. We must look inside the people. We must see what happened to their souls. And there one finds, he says, the inability to find a meaning in their lives, a kind of inward emptiness, and the incapacity for devotion to a true ideal. And, in his words, it needed only the psychological cunning of a Hitler to transform this apathy and emptiness into a violent frenzy willing to embrace everything, willing to give wholehearted devotion to anything, however perverse, if only it was the sort of thing that commanded such wholehearted devotion. And then, returning to his metaphor, slowly, slowly, the beating of the drum began to be heard, and the goose-stepping of the first stormtroopers, a drum bidding not awareness of inner resources, a drum bidding men to march not for the sake of a noble end, but to march for its own sake. And he says, it worked. This was the march of nihilism. March with one aim, to march, to trample underfoot whatever resists this march, which is the law of your life. And then he goes on to ask, how should we respond in 1945 in order to prevent what had taken place to take place again? I'm going to conclude at this point. I think that if one looks at these radio addresses consistently, one finds Fackenheim struggling with moral and social and religious questions that he takes to be the nature of the human condition. Situations in which there are tensions to be confronted and perplexity to be grappled with in a tragic human condition that requires for the religious person and invites for the religious person and perhaps requires this leap to give oneself over to the existing God and therefore to a relationship with something beyond ourselves. Now, I think in the end, his understanding of the human condition as this tension between the angel and the beast and ourselves and all that it implies is something that he carries forward through the 50s, through the 60s, and with a good deal of reformulation becomes the foundation of the existential worldview that he then employs in encountering the Holocaust. What changes is the kind of hopefulness and optimism that you find in these essays about what can be done to deal with this human situation. So I think that the publication of these, if we can put them together, will be a great window to the insights of a young philosopher, rabbi during the 1940s, trying to come to grips with his own intellectual development and with the social and cultural situation in North America during that period. Thank you.
So many thanks, Mike. We have time for what, half-hour questions? Sure. Okay, great. So John, you want to?
So thanks, Mike. This this point of departure that he takes from Moses of Kusi about the beast and the angel.
Right.
Did he think that also applied to Nazis? Does he make an exception for them from this category? And how does he reconcile the fact that that there's an angelic character to them, if that's indeed what he argued?
Well, first of all, I think that what Fackenheim is doing is something like the following. I think he reads and really is moved by Kierkegaard, right? That is, Kierkegaard as a kind of Kantian, right? That is, you start with the Kantian situation, you recognize that it's conflicted and it doesn't give you any solutions, and so you must leave it behind and transcend it in favor of something else. Fackenheim takes this view and retools the kind of Kantian bourgeois side of it, right, to a much broader conception of all the paradoxes that we wrestle with, right, in our human existence, and then where that leaves us in terms of the whole notion of meaning, whatever. He doesn't raise the question, does this apply to everybody? I think he takes this to be an account of the human condition for everyone, right? And he says that, I think he believes that he's found in Jewish sources, that is, rabbinic sources, and then this passage from Moses of Kusi. I tracked down the translation that he used. It came from a book of Jewish thoughts by Hertz, the chief rabbi of England. And it's Fackenheim's way of kind of beginning to work his way into Jewish sources and to say this same view of the human situation as not ultimately harmonious, as not capable of being unified, is present in Jewish sources. And it's there for everybody. Now, so I don't remember any place where he asks, well, do the Nazis also have an angelic side to them as well as a bestial side to them? Isn't there radical evil? Doesn't it suggest that at least some of them have no angelic side, right? Or something like that. I don't ever remember him kind of dealing with this, right, in any particular talk at all. But the gist of his position would be that this is an account of the human condition for everyone, right? And that everyone therefore struggles with how to, how to bring together the different ways in which this tension between is and ought is manifest, or between desire and reason, or however it's going to be.
Yeah. Just to follow up, I mean, there's nowhere in Jewish sources, for example, if you just stayed internally, there's no angelic side to Amalek, for example.
Right.
There was no redeeming there to be wiped off the face of the earth, right?
Right.
So there's no room in there for this.
I don't recall him saying this any place. That is, that there's someone who's satanic, right? Who basically have no redeeming side. Right. I just don't recall. And frankly, I think it would be kind of inconsistent at this stage of the game, right? Because even though he says there are no external explanations for the Holocaust from that psychology of the drum, he says we have to look inside. The suggestion being that there might be something in the psychology. Even if we can't explain it fully now, maybe that can help us, right, understand more, right? Later, of course, he will reject the satisfactory character of any explanations of any kind, right? Yes.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm really struck by the chronology in which he writes, right, 43, 44 to 48, because of course it's both the era of the Shoah and the era around the establishment of the State of Israel. But some of these things that we know other thinkers are grappling with very vocally at that moment, at least from what you told us, it's not clear to me whether he's talking about, for instance, all the birth pangs of Israel. So that leads me to two questions. One is, do you think for him there's a boundary between the human condition and the Jewish condition, right? This is a moment when many people are writing about the Jewish condition, and some existential philosophers like Sartre write about the Jewish condition as a way to write about the human condition in a way from a very different standpoint. So does he see himself as writing about both those, only the human condition? And the second question is, you mentioned Kierkegaard and Moses of Kusi. Are there other people with whom he sees himself in conversation or who he's reading, like Sholem or Arendt or Benjamin, writing about angels in a very different way, or someone else who writes a lot about theology, post-Shoah, Eliezer Berkovitz? I wonder about whether he sees himself in conversation with some of these people.
Okay. The Fackenheim, in this period, in the 40s, the two dominant influences in this earlier period in the 40s for him, outside of that kind of existential influence of Strauss on committing yourself to needing a sense of purpose for Jewish existence that transcends anything that could be ephemeral or qualified, and couldn't account for the life and death conviction that would have to lie behind it. So setting Strauss aside, and all he read was philosophy and gazettes, and he read it only for that purpose. The two major influences are, the one I didn't mention was Buber, and the other one is Kierkegaard. And he's read a great deal of Buber when he was in high school, and very much influenced by Buber, as many Jewish youth were in the Weimar period. He points out in his memoirs and often said that his classics teacher, when he graduated, had hoped he was going to go on to do graduate work in philosophy, in classics. And he told his classic teacher, no, the Jewish people needs me more. I'm going to go to become a Jewish leader, rabbi. And his classic teacher bought him 2 copies of Buber's The Kingdom of God and signed them, out of 2-1, right? That is, we are, and he kept one for himself and gave one to Emil, right? So Buber was an enormous influence on him, but he reads Buber now after around 1939-40 through the eyes of Kierkegaard. That is, he's an anti-Hegelian, but he doesn't know much about Hegel. But he knows that Hegel, and then he starts to read Schelling in this, I think, the period after 45 approximately, and he sees that Schelling has this later period where Schelling rejects Hegel's the kind of the unity of the whole as a kind of vaporous, right, and only a realm of possibility and not actuality, that there is an Urgrund and that there's an Ur-individual, and we have to cope with our existential, situation. At this point, I don't think he's read Sartre. I mean, he may have, but I don't recall any particular cases. Not long ago, my friend Mark Saperstein, who is a Jewish historian and is putting together a collection of sermons from the 1940s on the establishment of the State of Israel, saw in the list that I had put up someplace, that Emil had a sermon on the reestablishment of the Jewish state. It's a kind of nice platitudinous kind of thing, because Fackenheim, by his own admission, wasn't interested in Israel or Zionism until the late 60s, right? So he knew Berkowitz, of course, but much later, right? He met Arendt a couple of times, didn't like her at all, right? And later on wrote a criticism of her in one of his introductions to Mend the World, because he thought that the notion of the banality of evil was only half a thought. And he particularly didn't like Arendt because she insisted on speaking German when his wife Rose didn't know any German, and he thought that was insulting, right? Benjamin, I don't think he ever read, right? But then again, he once wrote a blurb for a book of Levinas's, but he never read any Levinas. So you never know. He might have read figures, and that he never said anything about. But I don't think he read any Benjamin, right? There's something very idiosyncratic about Fackenheim. He's a self-trained philosopher in a lot of ways, right? He didn't train in a program to be a philosopher. He went to Halle, heard some lectures by a few people, never worked with anybody. Went to Aberdeen, went to a couple of lectures by Laird, who was a British idealist, and W.S. Ferguson, who taught Plato, and didn't get much out of these guys. They were British philosophers. They didn't really understand anything about Hegel or German philosophy, and didn't seem to care, right? I mentioned this earlier to a friend. I had lunch, that at the end of The Matter of Morals, when he recommended to the people over the radio who they should read as good moral philosophers, he said, well, there's the classics, and he mentions Aristotle, Butler's Sermons, Utilitarianism, Mill, and Kant's Grundlagen, the Foundations. And then he said, of modern writers, you should read C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity, which were these popular moral Christian lectures that were given by Lewis during the late 30s and 40s. And C.E.M. Joanne, who was a kind of ethicist, popular moral thinker in England, he kind of constructed his own way of thinking about these things. That's why all this angel and beast talk is his way of using the philosophical tradition and the Jewish tradition to articulate a view about existentialism that he's coming to sort of on his own. It's before he's read Heidegger. I'm pretty sure he hadn't read Heidegger in the 40s, right? So, and he tried to read Rosenzweig, but didn't get very much out of it, so didn't come back to Rosenzweig until later. Does that help at all? Right? It gives you a sense from where he was, right, in this period. What's so incredibly intriguing to me is that as you start to read his essays of the 60s, and then what become the background to his understanding in God's presence of history of the Jewish condition and the human condition, and how he articulates it in terms of all this Hegelian vocabulary of a dialectic between the finite, the infinite, and all that, it comes out of the views that he's already giving expression to in so many of these lectures and talks as the kind of human situation that we have to confront in order to cope morally with and socially, and politically with our situation.
I was fascinated to see that one of the radio addresses concerns the Jacob and Esau story in the Bible, and it's, if I remember the title, it's the issue of the other. So in a way, it's interesting that he would be using that terminology this early. It hasn't yet, I think, quite become as popular as it was to become. This, of course, connects in a way to Levinas, your other major figure. And I want to hear you compare them on this issue, but also I was fascinated by the fact you say he was not interested in Zionism until much, much later, until the 60s. Does he carry into that Zionist period any interest in the question of the other, that is, say, in particular the Palestinian? Because as, of course, you and I have gone around and around on Levinas's relationship to the Palestinians and the otherness of the Palestinians. He was, as I understand his history, a fairly right-wing Zionist. And I looked recently at the Haaretz obituary, and it says, you said that he was not very popular in Israel, that the reason why he was not popular was because he was a right-wing Zionist. And during this period, now, alas, perhaps it's different, during this period to be a right-wing Zionist made you marginal among at least the intellectuals. So what I'm asking you is a longer question, more than just this period, his attitude towards otherness, towards the Palestinians in particular, towards Zionism as he understood it while he was living in Israel during the last 20 years of his life.
It's an enormous question. I mean, and I think it's a really complicated question, and it's not a question that always has sort of the happiest side to it, so to speak, right? He really doesn't write anything of any seriousness about Zionism until the early 1970s. He has a review of Buber's little book, Israel and Palestine. He doesn't comment on a theme that was very prominent for Buber, that is the relationship of the people who already lived in the land and the Jew. It's not of interest to him. What he talks about in the review, which is like from around 1954 or something like that, is the relationship between the universal and the particular when it comes to nation, messianism, nation, right, and history and such things. He's fairly consistent in the first important things that he writes about Zionism in the early 70s are very positive pieces about the Jewish return to the Jewish state and how it exemplifies features of what he takes to be the character of authentic or genuine response to the atrocities of Nazism. And that is a combination of what he calls secular self-reliance and religious purpose. So he's willing to accommodate the sense that he deeply believed, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, that Israel was committed to Jewish purposes, and that meant to high moral purposes, because there's a lot of prophetic morality in Fackenheim, sort of in the background, right? But at the same time, he has no particular attentiveness to the challenges that requires on the ground, so to speak. And as time goes on in the 70s, and then afterwards, he's extremely critical of Arafat and world public opinion and whatever. And while at certain moments I think that he wrote things for the popular press, not so much in Israel, but particularly in the 90s, he wrote for the Canadian National Jewish Publication, often articles, but Canadian Jewish News, right? And he wrote frequently for them. And he had a kind of realism about his response to contemporary affairs, but he was never sensitive to the plight of the Palestinians. And I don't, now that takes me back to your first comment. I don't remember exactly what he said about Jacob and Esau. Recently I haven't reread that, so I can't speak of it. I will say that there is a kind of lacuna in his thinking, and that's about the interpersonal, right? I once thought that there are certain moments in his thinking where he does talk about community or social responsibility, and it definitely comes out occasionally. But it plays nothing like the role that it does for Levinas, and even for Buber, or I think for Rosenzweig. I mean, there's a sense in which they are all communitarian thinkers of a certain kind. And Fackenheim is not. He's still very individualistic in his own way about his existentialism, so to speak, right? And even those moments when I think you can find him suggesting, he has an essay on Kantianism, for example. It says, Kantianism raises this enormous problem for any revealed religion. How can you be both moral and be a revealed religion? After all, if the command is heteronymous, then it can't be moral, right? The principles can't be moral. And he has this way of articulating an answer that's very Buberian, and says in the end that for Judaism, the relationship to the other person and the relationship to God are somehow joined, right? And you can't have one without the other, right? But he doesn't take it anyplace, right? And he doesn't then ask, well, who are the others? And who were the others for Buber, after all, right? It's just an enormous lacuna. Now, when he gets to Israel, I think that there's no question that the extremity of his views on certain occasions puts him into conflict with unusual figures. I remember once when he was involved with a radio debate with Leibovich, who is not a person one would want to argue with, right, in public. And Leibovich just kind of tore him apart in a certain sense. And of course, Leibovich, from a halakhic point of view, maybe right wing, but from another point of view, he was extremely kind of attuned to, he was the kind of person that a lot of very liberal Orthodox like to quote, right? And Fackenheim just, he couldn't do it. I mean, he couldn't handle it, right? He could say what he wanted to say, but it was not something that people wanted to hear, right? Certainly the audience that would be willing to listen to him. So that was part of the reason that I, in 1987, felt that an anthology of his writings that showed the sweep of his thought and the armature of his thinking would show that the whole issue of whether or not he was willing to, what his political alignment was on various issues, was not intimately connected with the kind of armature and structure of his thought. And I still believe that to a substantial degree. I mean, I think that anybody who was as committed as he was to Buber's thinking and is well read in all that Buber wrote, certainly, and knew so many of the same people, right? That it's not that he wasn't a person with genuine concern for others. He was. I mean, the talk that he gives about the displaced persons, it's not just Jewish displaced persons. And he's not just concerned about Jews. He spent his entire life dealing with Jewish-Christian dialogue in Canada in a major sort of way, and confronted the power of the church on many issues and such. But when it came to the Palestinians, once he had committed himself to Israel, to him it was a life and death struggle. And yes.
You mentioned at the end of the talk that what had changed in the 1960s is not so much his preoccupation with the human condition and the angel and beast paradigm, but that he approached it with some newly found optimism. And I was wondering what you think the source of this optimism was.
Well, actually, I think that in these earlier talks, there's a kind of optimism about, I mean, it's a tragic situation, but by giving yourself over to God, that will answer. He gives that up, right? I mean, there's no question that goes. The two critical things that happened to him, as I like to think of it, were that he met Elie Wiesel. And Wiesel in 1965 was not widely read. I don't know if you know the story of Night, that when it was published in English translation, it sold like 200 copies or something like that, in 1959 or 16. Wiesel was almost unknown until the issue over the Soviet Jewry arose, and Wiesel made a trip to the Soviet Union and came back and published a short memoir called The Jews of Silence. It was around that time that these theologians, Fackenheim and Schwarzschild at Washington University, and Sheldon Spiegel at JTS, that there were just lots of people from the East Coast and around who were doing this kind of existential theology and trying to think through Judaism in this situation that they found themselves in. They realized that Wiesel was an important voice for them. And so they invited him to one of these meetings, I think it was in '65, and he came, and he spoke to them, and Fackenheim came away, he wasn't the only one, with the sense that here was a man whose soul had gone through the fires of hell. And nonetheless, he had a faith that had somehow persisted, even if it was conflicted and problematic. It was the Wiesel who wrote Past the End of Night. Right? At the end of Night, his father's died, God is hanging on the gallows, and then he goes on and writes The Gates of the Forest and The Town Beyond the Wall and other things, and Messengers of God. And Wiesel shows in his person that one can confront extraordinary evil, and yet one's faith can survive, even if conflicted. That's one thing. The second thing was that he had spent 10 years studying Hegel, finally believed that he could write on the system. But if you read his book on religious dimension in Hegel's thought, it ends at the very end with the thought that if Hegel were alive today, he would not be a Hegelian. Because Hegel thought that philosophy was life reenacted in thought, and therefore reenacted without all the contradictions. Everything gets wiped out, right? And that Hegel would have realized that the evil of Nazism and the atrocities was so great that no thought could comprehend it. And once he realized that, he realized that the way to cope with the Holocaust was not to try to think it out, so to speak, but to engage with it. And the only possible way of engaging with the most horrific is through resistance. And that's what the 614th Commandment is all about. It's about resistance and opposition. And later on in To Mend the World, he calls this, he goes through a whole kind of Schellingian argument, digression, it's 50 pages, to give an account of what he calls the ontological foundations of resistance. That is, at the moment when seeking to come to grips with the whole of horror that's the greater than the sum of the parts, you are shocked and pulled back, but at the same time you realize that the only possible genuine response is opposition. Right? And it's those insights, it's the existential one of Wiesel and the intellectual, philosophical one of Hegel, and what Hegel would be, right? What Hegelianism would be today, that enabled him to take the next step, so to speak. Well, thank you.
Let us thank you.
You mean, yes, you know, I was